Good afternoon, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's virtual book talk series. Today's program features Ben Bascom and his new book, Feeling Singular: Queer Masculinities in the Early United States, which was published last year by Oxford University Press. The virtual book talk series features recent work broadly related to book history, print culture, and material text. And they often are based on research conducted in the AAS collections. The American Antiquarian Society is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence in central Massachusetts. We were both a library and a learned society, founded in 1812 by the printer Isaiah Thomas, and our goal is to foster a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in our collection of primary sources, which currently numbers approximately 4.5 million individual items. These span nearly 4 centuries and include items such as Revolutionary War pamphlets and broadsides, Caribbean newspapers, daguerreotypes and lithographs, and other examples of the graphic arts, children's books, board games, cookbooks, and much, much more. And to learn more about us, please visit our website, www.americanantiquarian.org. AAS fosters an inclusive community of inquiry through our support for scholarship and through our public programs. We welcome researchers from around the country and around the world to use the collections, both in person and digitally. My name is John Garcia, the Society's Director of Scholarly Programs and Partnerships, and I'm joined behind the scenes today by my colleague, Lauren Havilis. Throughout the program, Lauren will post useful information to the chat, including a link where you can learn more to purchase a copy of Ben Bascom's book with a discount code from the publisher. As a reminder to all, today's program is being recorded and it will be available soon on the AAS YouTube channel. We thank you for joining us, and as a nonprofit organization, we greatly appreciate any support you can lend to help us with our mission. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Ben Bascom is Assistant Professor of English at Ball State University, where he teaches early and 19th century American literatures and contemporary LGBTQ studies. He has published widely in journals such as Arizona Quarterly, American Literary History, Early American Literature, among others. And he has twice been an AAS Fellow, once as a Peterson Fellow when he was in graduate school, and most recently as an NEH long-term fellow when Ben was completing research that led to Feeling Singular. And currently, starting this summer, he'll be in residence at the William Clements Library at the University of Michigan, where he'll be working on his newest project, Eccentric Queers, Sexuality and Debility in the 19th Century. Now it's my great pleasure to turn things over to Ben Bascom.
Thank you so much, John. It is a huge pleasure to gather with you all virtually like this. The American Antiquarian Society has been an intellectual home for me for many years, and I'm grateful for all the librarians and curators, too many to name right now, but they've been so profoundly helpful on my career and trajectory. So I'm grateful for them and grateful for this opportunity to gather to talk about this book that I wrote. And I begin this talk actually by turning to a failed cover that was proposed. When I was a fellow at American Antiquarian Society, I would often go to the Worcester Art Museum, where I just absolutely fell in love with Erastus Salisbury Field's portraits of women. And so when my editor proposed a cover, I suggested to do something with an Erastus Salisbury Field. And then they did that. And then I had this moment where I thought, oh, this could be interesting for Instagram self-promotion. Thankfully, we went another direction. I'd like to touch on the cover a bit and outline what I will be talking about today. So the cover that you see before you is a caricature portrait of the Chevalier de Leon, who was a very widely known celebrity who presented in a gender queer or gender variant manner. And in fact, I often think about the way gender in this project comes to name what we give to the social imperative to conform. And I want us to think about that as we delve into some of the texts that I look at. So, as I mentioned, in this talk today, I'll be outlining a couple figures that I discuss in my book. I have the chapter outline here on the left. I'll be focusing in on these three figures. In my book, in total, I examine the writings of individuals who aspired to leave behind some form of a testament to their lives. For the most part, these individuals felt themselves singular or important and believed that their perspective could shape the world that they were in. But against their best wishes, their written life narratives never circulated as they had hoped, or their makeshift inventions and monuments never fully materialized into the status that they had wanted. So, for my talk today, I'm going to highlight a few of these figures and delve into a bit more about what we can learn through ephemerality. While working on this book project, one figure of speech that kept returning to me was synecdoche. A synecdoche is when a part stands for a whole, and I began to wonder, how does synecdoche work within a US American context where a figure can become representative? I think about someone like Benjamin Franklin, right? Who uh, built a life that then became a sort of touchstone for early Americans then and today as a symbol of a kind of rags to riches figuration. Um, but this trope of synecdoche relies on a lot of power, a lot of opportunity to be transformed from individual into representative. And I began to wonder, as I was working on this book, the way that state power, violence, risk, precarity all figure into the ways individuals become legible to become representative. There's a lot of pressure done to sort of transform an individual into something larger. Um, and this led me to several insights that I explore in the book. One is that our conceptions of individuality are deeply, in a way, modern, based in the 20th century. Our conceptions of a celebrated individuality does not like have a is not operative in this early 18th century, late 18th, early 19th century moment. And in fact, individuality or identity is a product of significant power relations. Who can become an individual is determined by a series of other factors. In the book, I also highlight the way in which masculinity is a type of social aesthetic that mediates identity, but it's also never stable. It's always in flux. It's always in conversation with power and privilege, which helps me set up the deeper insights of my book, which are centered around queer. And that's how queer is both a noun, a verb, and an adjective. There's ways in which we can think about how a particular figure might queer norms or might be themselves queer in some manner. I know that's a lot to think with. And as I was working on my book, I was really inspired by Daniel Diaz Couch's American Fragments and William Hunting Howell's Against Self-Reliance for how they themselves tried to think with the ways that individual subjects never really cohere into a established pattern this era. So as I was um, as I mentioned, my book sort of thinks about these various individuals and their aspirations for renown. And I'd like to begin by thinking about the first figure I look at in my book, John Fitch. I was introduced to John Fitch by my PhD advisor at University of Illinois, Trish Lochran. And when I read his TypeScript manuscript that was, or his manuscript that was published into a book in 1976, I became fascinated. I was like, who is this person in the 1780s, 90s who wrote volumes about himself, who wrote huge books that were all about his interior life. I became fascinated by what this person meant to himself and to others, especially when I came across this interesting moment that he writes in his one of his first manuscripts that, quote, I have already inadvertently made myself so noticed that I never can in future conceal myself. I was intrigued, like, how does this person think that they're so noticed that they can never be hidden. They can never not, be in some way known. When I've never heard of this person, and nor had anyone else that I knew. Come to find out, John Fitch had invented a steamboat in the 1780s and had a steamboat ferrying business that would carry people across the Delaware in Philadelphia. And he had that until he got embroiled in a quasi menage a trois with his business partner Henry Voigt and his lover Mary Craft. And I was intrigued by this story of a failed inventor who became too close with people, and it was interpersonal life that led to his undoing. One of the interesting things that I study in the book is this curious poem that John Fitch wrote near the end of his life. And in it, he articulates why he failed at building a steamboat and he blames it on others. And there's an interesting way to get at how Fitch is thinking about his masculinity through this poem. I'm going to read it. For full the scope of 7 years, steamboats excited hopes and fears in me. But now I see it plain, all further progress is in vain, and I'm resolved to quit a scheming and be no longer of patents dreaming. As for my partners, damn them all. They took me up to let me fall. For when me scheme was near perfection, it proved abortive by their defection. They let it stop for want of rhino, then swore the cause of failure mino. The placing the blame of his lack of celebrity on others, Fitch comes to say that they let him fall, that nothing about him determined his failure to secure his name as the singular inventor of the steamboat, but it was others. In the book, I play around with what's called masculine and feminine rhymes in this poem. Rhino, of course, means money, and how he rhymes with mino becomes this like effort at bringing things together but failing at it. Um, Fitch deposited his manuscripts and other things that he wrote in the Library Company of Philadelphia, where on the cover of it, he sealed it with a letter articulating that if Thomas Jefferson were to ever run for the president's office, that the librarian was to break the seal and publish this, because if people read his life narrative, they would know to not elect Thomas Jefferson. Unfortunately, Fitch died in 1798, and his book never circulated as he had hoped. The other thing I want to touch on with Fitch is in his book, he explains that he's no grammarian and he wishes the whole of his works to be revised. He wants someone to come along who has an education, who has the wherewithal to edit his life into a book and to do that. But of course, what we have today is this curious book that in the 1976 transcription of it has retained all of Fitch's curious spellings. The norms of book history retain the very writing problems that Fitch wanted to eliminate. He wanted someone to come and fix his book to make him seem kind of like a Franklin figure, or to make him seem very legible to others. In the book that I've in Feeling Singular, I conclude a portion by thinking about this really strange postcard from the early 20th century that marks John Fitch's totally nondescript burial. And I do this to think about the aspiration Fitch had for some sort of celebrity and renown and its material existence, which helps me also pivot from another figure I look at, the self-declared Lord Timothy Dexter, So opposite of Fitch, who aspired to a sort of renown and celebrity, Timothy Dexter actually kind of arrived there. He invested and speculated in currency while the continental currency was not worth anything. After the Constitution, he became massively wealthy. He had been a leather dresser in Massachusetts area, and then suddenly has all of this money where he can then build huge statues of himself, of others, such as Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams, Napoleon Bonaparte, William Tell, all of these people who sort of like, sorry, William Pitt, who he places himself amidst to be this sort of celebrated figure who's able to amass wealth and present it in this very gaudy fashion. So where Fitch also wanted other people to clean up his text, to make it seem proper, to make it seem legible, Timothy Dexter, on the other hand, published the book called A Pickle for the Knowing Ones. It's kind of a smaller pamphlet. And in it, he insisted on phonetic spelling and on kind of willy-nilly punctuation and no sense of regular norms or protocol of print. Um, a pickle for the knowing ones, as you see here, is kind of incoherent. He starts, to mankind at large, the time is come at last, the great day of rejoicing. What is that? Why, I will tell you. Those three kings is raised, you mean should now be raised on the first royal arch. It's a little bit of a jumble, but he's describing on the in his front yard, he had a portrait, three statues of George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson in his front yard, and he called them the Royal Arch and the Kings. So Dexter writes this curious, text that uses no punctuation, that's all about a riddle and all about something kind of curious to get people to be intrigued. He's seeking attention through doing all of these bombastic and over the top presentations of self. Additionally, Dexter was able to get a likeness of himself printed, and he would sell it through the newspaper. Another thing I want to touch on is this image you see on the left is another image of Dexter, contemporaneous, probably one of the first ones actually that we have of Dexter. And it was found by the historian von Scribner, who's actually working on a book on Dexter, a biography. It's going to be a really fascinating project. But at the old Museum of Old Newbury, he was able to find this drawing of Timothy Dexter to sort of like show the way that people would have likenesses of him and maybe put them on their wall or something. So I'd like to touch on one other thing with Dexter. It's that in his Pickle for the Knowing Ones, he includes this curious moment where he declares himself the first lord in the United States of America, now of Newburyport. This is a curious moment because, of course, at the time, attachment to monarchy would not necessarily be a celebrated thing for anyone to do, but Dexter's able to sort of flaunt this attachment to monarchy in a way that shows his aspirations to grandiosity and sort of bombasticness. The other point I want to touch on is in the Royal Arch that he has in his front yard, where he includes George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams. There's a description of his painter. His name's Babson, who was painting these statues in the 1800, and he asks Babson to depict Thomas Jefferson signing the Constitution. And Babson's like, oh, that wasn't Jefferson. Jefferson, did the Declaration of Independence. But Dexter had won so much money through speculating after the Constitution that he wanted the Constitution to be held by Jefferson. according to Samuel Napa, a 19th century historian, Dexter shot at the artist to make him put the Constitution in Jefferson's hand because that's how he wanted to remember the text. So what I'm getting at is this over the top excessiveness at preserving a self for later observation, right? Dexter has this fantasy that he will be able to put himself in the future. Um, and here are some images that are the last preserving some of the last images that survived a big hurricane that came in 1815 and that destroyed most of these statues. So the surviving remnants of Dexter statues suggest this kind of failed effort at cultural longevity. Dexter had wanted the statues to be turned to be made into marble eventually, but he died before he could execute that. Um, I think with Dexter, queerness comes with this kind of like corrosive nature. He has this aspiration for remembrance, and he comes to break all of these social taboos in different ways. Um, Now, one of the individuals that Dexter employed to help celebrate his name and to help get his name out there was a itinerant peddler and poet named Jonathan Plummer. Um, Jonathan Plummer was known for being kicked out for street preaching in various cities and towns in the area. Plummer also wrote a life narrative that never circulated. I'm going to get into that in a little bit. But a really curious moment that Plummer offers in the opening of his life narrative is this connection that he makes to printing technology and his use of the first person singular I. So he writes, "You must allow us to use we and us in some places in the room of I, etc. If you deny us this liberty, we fear it will be a damage to our printers. They have a pretty large stock of types, but we fear they will not be able to muster without trouble capital I's enough to print all this work, if printed in the manner that some of it will appear in." So here, very curiously, Dexter's protege, self-declared poet laureate, articulates that there's not enough I's, letter capital I's, in the printing establishment that he's using to actually get his material out there. So he's going to use a sort of royal we. He's going to use us and we to get his points across. Let me turn even deeper into Plummer here as we sort of turn into a portion of the book that helps highlight the way queerness and masculinity intersect in my project. So in Feeling Singular, I get to this moment with Plummer because he has this time in around the 1790s that he discusses walking around Newburyport, the sea town there, and explains that he, quote, was passing near a woman that I expect is very fond of adultery. He writes in a broadside that he sold from his fishmongering basket and, quote, happened to hear her utter words. He is an hermaphrodite. In other circulating broadsides, Plummer publicizes and perpetuates this specific charge against himself, highlighting his anxious desire to correct any potential gossip about his suspect sex, even as he tries to perform unconcern, writing, quote, I might have convinced her quickly, I believe, in the street where she stood, that the highest had made me well and made me truly and properly a man, but I did not stop to do it. And so little did I care about what she said that without even telling her, I went on my way. So this is obviously a pretty curious anecdote, one that presents a type of coming out that might suggest the speaker doth protest too much, a moment of classic projection that keeps something hidden, an aesthetic of postured exposure. Plummer is perpetuating the very rumor that he's trying to disabuse. So I'm going to sketch out what this curious broadside moment and others like it from the Plummer archive might teach us about sex. Building from recent work in sexuality studies from Greta LaFleur, Benjamin Kahan, and Jordan Alexander Stein that center archival research to tell the multiple emergences of the categories we imbue with the term sexuality, I endeavor to show the prospects for thinking about the history of sexuality through textual ephemera. In a manner, I hope my words will constellate together some thoughts around a particular exposure and its implications for thinking about sexuality. Returning to Plummer, we might see how the question of Plummer's sex foregrounds an entire social world that seems deeply invested in deciphering and uncovering, prodding and plumbing the truth of Plummer's sex. The compartmentalization of sex and sexuality as a facet of individuality that must be hidden in plain sight becomes oddly reflected in Plummer. As a form of identification, sexuality emerges as a demarcation that pretends to stabilize a subject along vectors of desire, funneling feeling and attachment in ways made legible. I want to get into this a bit more with another broadside. So in this broadside, Looking Glass for Lovers of Strong Drink, Plummer includes the rumors that others repeat about him, which he again categorizes as persecution. Quote, one man, Jonathan Plummer, don't marry, commit fornication, nor adultery. Is he not a Christian? He writes and talks against lewdness. Another man, he is an hermaphrodite. He rails against pleasures that he can't enjoy, begrudging those who can enjoy it, their happiness. You may rest assured that it was not Christianity that kept him from being forced to marry or pay for a bastard long ago. These two anecdotes set up a curious dichotomy. The first one presumes that Plummer's life testifies to his Christianity, his ostensible position against lewdness and refusal to commit fornication or adultery. Yet the rumor implies that Plummer has knowledge about sex, asserting that it is not religion that prohibited Plummer from producing offspring, but rather some form of non-procreative sex. It is curious to consider how he positions his normativity. I'm going to quote a little bit longer here. There must seems to be two ways for me to help myself, he writes, in regard to this matter, which is to shew the proofs of my manhood to many men and women, or publish one of two certificates, which I have got from two doctors, who I guess are very skillful physicians, on the important subject. Here he suggests that he could expose his manhood to an indeterminate number of individuals, though he understandably has qualms about that, writing, the latter seems to be the most decent, easy, and proper of the two. I therefore give it the preference. Providing signatures, one noting that, quote, I, being a physician, have inspected the said Plummer and found him to be truly and properly a man. Not only did Plummer never marry and establish a family, two hallmarks of Republican belonging in the new nation, but his life narrative, which he wrote in the vein of the era's supposed great men, failed to be the family-focused and circulated cultural artifact he wished it to be. At his death in 1819, he had amassed about $1,400, which in today's currency might be about $28,000, and wrote in his will that he desired that the whole of his book would be republished and given away within 4 years after his decease to households. And he wanted this to be at least 1,000 copy run. The public executor, however, gave Plummer's money to his estranged family, and the book was never printed, or was never recirculated after this initial printing. What we are left with today is just the remnant of Plummer's 1797 printing, the only extant copy missing several pieces from the concluding pages of the first section and various pages throughout. This is a fascinating text that's held at the Phillips Library, as part of the Peabody Essex Museum, and it has been put on early American imprints, but the copy is very difficult to read. So with the help of Ball State undergrad and graduate students, I've been able to work on a transcription of this text. But as a cultural object, not considered valuable enough to be preserved in its contemporaneous moment, Plummer's sketch of the history of the life and adventures of Jonathan Plummer Jr., written by himself, wears the precarity of its uneven preservation. The single material copy, um, preserved, as I mentioned, in the Phillips Library, tells us a lot about the dynamics of belonging and attachment in the early Republic, especially for those individuals who did not fit neatly within the era's stable domestic formations, yet still had access to some form or means of self-representation to leave behind writings, however piecemeal their preservation. So while in his life he renounced sexual relations, in his retold dreams, he implies a particular knowledge about sex that belies such an insistence on celibacy, which, as I show here, he kind of does a portmanteau with celibate and celebrate into celibacy. So that's his sort of sexual position that he occupies. In the majority of my remarks today, I'll focus on one suggestive narrated dream that he shares in his printed life narrative. Plummer writes, quote, "I dreamed that a poor old man, displaying one of his members which must not be named, and overwhelmed with grief, stood before me. He seemed to be awfully afraid that the member was too big or too little, too long or too short. What seemed to trouble him most was that he could not tell whether it had any, all, or none of them failings. Considering his earlier encounter with the woman who accuses him of being a hermaphrodite or having suspect sex, and the subsequent rumor that he tried to dispel, this narrated dream may illustrate Plummer's anxiety at measuring up to the norms of sex and masculinity. That's a pretty obvious reading, right? This dream seems deeply invested in an imagined inadequacy that Plummer seeks to undo through his broadsides. Continuing his description, he writes, "I was ready to tell him that the length and girth of it could certainly be taken, when the idea of what I was going to say made me smile so heartily in my sleep that I woke without speaking." Like his refusal to share in print whatever he learned through his process of embracing celibacy, he evokes silence and a smile here upon waking up from the imagined experience, and this smile seems to suggest that there's something else going on, hinting at how he keeps parts of himself undisclosed to produce moments of secretive intimacy. Now, secrets and the category that we today recognize as sexuality are closely associated in Plummer's writings. Earlier in his narrative, and after he describes his turn to celibacy, Plummer discusses several communications and dreams on the subject that have since been received. Importantly, he insists that his communications and dreams would be improper to put in print, that they must remain secretively outside the public sphere and ensconced in private and interpersonal relations, encounters, and transactions. He writes, "These either have something in them or some discoveries were made in consequence of them that renders them improper to be printed." Plummer continues writing that this, and might just point out that this reference to secrecy is unusual for Plummer. He seems so adamant at saying what comes to his mind, but here in this narrative, he's like, "I've got a secret and I would love to sell it to people." And this is the part that I'm going to read here. He says, "That part of my subject which I am now on is truly delicate. A very great number of ideas must remain unrecorded. These are of such amazing importance to the world that I believe people who prize health or anything near a proper rate will do well to call on me in private and to pay me for a few observations, which it is in my humble opinion would be more serviceable to them than one or two, three or four, 5 or 6 hundred millions of dollars would be. So here, Plummer is saying that he's got something to share, but he can't put it into print. And it'd be worth so many hundreds of millions of dollars. Um, Harboring a secret, Plummer believes he has knowledge that would be unbecoming, to use a synonym for improper, in the sense that it shifts one's sense of self. But perhaps taking a page from Plummer, I might stop here and with a tantalizing invitation to read the rest of the book and see the sort of singularities that come into formation. So I might stop there and open it up to John.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Thank you. And I also want to just point out at this point that those in the audience, please put your questions into the Q&A portion at the bottom of the screen. So we do have plenty of time for questions. And I just to kick things off, Ben, one of the things I found most fascinating was you touched on this earlier, the way that ephemera, right? These kind of printed, kind of grubby pamphlets, these kinds of cast-off things, texts that only survive in one copy. Some of them are incomplete, right? In some ways, they, as you said, they kind of bear the evidence of failed aspirations to what you describe as Republican representativeness in print. You give us a number of fascinating examples, and there really wasn't time in your talk to give them all, but I wanted to ask if you could say a little bit more about one of your examples, who was a man named Jeffrey Brace, right? This is an individual from Vermont, and unlike Plummer and Fitch, he was a free African American who turned to print for his own project. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because I think it really adds to the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question, John. And I wish I'd had all the time in the world to talk about all these really interesting figures. Jeffrey Brace was born Borio Brench in West Africa and was captured into slavery. There's a terrific book that actually Carrie J. Winter, I might just like shout her name. She did an edited collection of this book several years back. Um, Brace, after having fought in the 7 Years' War as an enslaved soldier and in the Revolutionary War as an enslaved soldier, he was manumitted and determined to get as far from um, the implications of chattel slavery as possible, and he saw Vermont as that space. In the book, he mentions like he was thinking about going to Kentucky with another individual, but decides that that's too precarious. So he goes to Vermont, and while he's in Vermont, he marries a woman named Susanna, and they start a maple sugar sort of farm as a way to protest plantation produced slavery in the Caribbean. Um, However, Jeffrey Brace loses his eyesight and becomes sort of a disabled veteran. And a poor working class lawyer named Benjamin Franklin Prentice, and as Carrie Winters suggests, probably Brace's son, work together to put his life story together. So they publish a book called The Blind African Slave in 1810. And it's published in St. Albans, Vermont, which is the northern section of Vermont. And after its publication, though, both Jeffrey Brace and Benjamin Franklin Prentice are warned out of town. They're forced to remove themselves because the way the book was critiquing white supremacy and the ramifications of slavery that that this family experiences in the North. So the book never really had a chance to circulate in the way that, say, Timothy Dexter could with his sort of gibberish, right? But instead, the book becomes um, this text that does not have the network to circulate its anti-slavery message. And so for many years, the people kind of didn't either read the text until actually Carrie Winters discovered it while a graduate student doing project on documenting the South online database. So I bring that up because in a lot of ways, the figures I look at have differing attachments to state power and the opportunities for representativeness. Brace understood that he needed to tell his story. He experienced the Middle Passage in the book. It discusses the Middle Passage, but there was so much onus and pressure to get his ideas not to circulate that it became a sort of a thwarted book, a book that didn't have the opportunity to be what the author had aspired it to be. So that's a little bit about Jeffrey Brace.
That's great. We have a question here. Somebody is asking about, I think they want to just get a sense of the bigger project, how you did the research. What was it like to work on this project? The question here, can you say more about the challenges or successes you encountered working with these materials? And again, I think as you've shown, the way that you really had to go and track down some things that many people are not even aware of, or in some cases survive only in single copies. So could you say more about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks for that question. I am intrigued by things. I remember growing up, looking through my mom's photo albums of her family. She was from Florida, and I was always intrigued by. I never met my grandfather. He was actually born in 1895, but he had all these narratives that he wrote. Right, he was an engineer. He lost his leg in World War One, and whenever I'm home with my mom, I would look through these materials as I was a graduate student. I just found myself interested in things that get preserved, but kind of don't have a strong sense of use initially, right? So as I'm finishing my PhD at the University of Illinois, I get intrigued by John Fitch. I'm like, there's something there. There's like a curious aspiration. There's a messiness that seems um, ironed out in a lot of the narratives that I grew up hearing about the early United States. And then I just remember presenting actually a portion of this book or sorry, a portion of a John Fitch chapter, and I met a professor at a Charles Brockner Brown conference who just randomly mentioned, "Oh, this person seems like Jonathan Plummer." Um, I'd never heard of Jonathan Plummer in my life, and nor had anyone here probably. And it was just on the back burner. I was like, this person's kind of curious, okay. Um, and then it just, as I would circulate at conferences, as I would share ideas, it just became like, oh, people kind of are interested in these stories of eccentrics, these stories of figures that did not achieve what they had hoped to achieve, but were positioned in different positionalities. And so my dissertation became this sort of like hodgepodge of figures. And then the problem with the book became, how do you actually get a narrative arc around them all? And then I realized the narrative arc tells us a lot about histories of masculinity, histories of individuality, and the ways in which queerness um, tells us a lot about who and how people think of themselves as representative. Um, I think that my book has a lot to share about our present world and the ways in which forms of masculinity get sort of masculinity is allowed to be this messy, bombastic thing as it draws attention to itself and then creates its own sense of norms or its own sense of stability. Um, yeah, so identifying I just think I love the idea of like going into an archive and just starting doing research, getting intrigued by someone's life and digging in, right? So that's a little bit of a long-winded account, but I mean, I think that the most valuable thing is just to be willing to sit with people's stories and sort of see what comes out through attending them.
It's great, and I think it really is a testament to the book, the way that it really does advance conversations about the way that ideas of queer theory can enliven some topics that might seem a bit familiar, right? This the idea of the Republican representativeness. I would love to hear more about a little bit more about how the term queer works as a concept, right? You say at one point that it's both a verb, an adjective, and a noun, but this might actually fold into a question that just came in from Mary Kelly, and she asks, to what degree is your sense of the book's current implication or value, or has the value changed in light of recent attempts to eradicate queer national archives and individually as well? So I'm really thinking perhaps how you might have thoughts about how the book relates to our own present moment.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. That's a terrific question. I think I sit with Eve Sedgwick's insights in I forget what book, but she sort of has this moment where she's like, you look long enough and you find queerness. Like queerness is not something that's gonna be like vanish based on uh officiality or institutional rejection. Um, and I think maybe part of it is that as I was looking, doing this project, um, I both saw the ways queerness was operative and attempted to be sort of tamped out or not registered in the archive I was looking at. So I mean, yeah, I think that let me just take a step back to just say also, and I'm thinking here of like Tori Peters' work, a contemporary trans novelist. Like, there's there's always transness and queerness. There's always forms and lives that are marked as somehow not part of an official narrative. And I think that like that's kind of what I think we need to sort of like continue to bring forward, the ways in which um, we've always had forms of gender difference and forms of queerness that can't simply be declared non-operative, right? And I think my book, in a way, maybe provides language for seeing that in the past, and seeing the ways that uh, there's always been queerness. The effort at stamping out queerness or making a norm the form, like the strongest thing, um, there's always like that creates conditions to maybe see it, but I think that there's always this like struggle of a sense of resisting a norm that would push one out, right? I hope that answers your question.
It does, and we have so Don James McLaughlin posted a question into the chat, which I think this is, I think, definitely bears and follows up on what you were just speaking about. So he writes that he says he's a big fan of the book and really couldn't put it down, and I think that definitely was the case for me as well. But he wants to know he wants to know there's an important relationship, the question about the obscurity that awaited these early national founding flops, and the relationship to queer theory's interest in the value of marginalized cultures and politics that occupy the periphery in valuable ways. This poses a challenge to the familiar mantra out of the closet and into the streets. And since there is value inherent to negotiated spaces of surreptitious actions, do you feel that there is a time for queer theory and history to turn greater attention to the political value of obscurity and peripheral action?
Great. I love that question. Thank you so much, Don James. Absolutely. I mean, I think that there's such unnoticed value in the quiet forms of queerness that are always already doing their work, no matter if they're being observed or not. I think there's a politics of observation and a politics of like representativeness and a politics of legibility that sometimes can actually do harm to force an outedness or to force a presentation that actually might be totally stamped out by the powers that be. And so there's like a kind of incubation that's necessary sometimes, where there's like a politics of of waiting or a politics of uh, being prepared for that spotlight that comes, maybe. What your point brings up really usefully for me, Don James, is queer theory is deeply thinking about, the figure of the marginal, the figure of the outsider. And Heather Love's work in Underdog sort of like does this brilliantly, where, she's thinking about how do you think about outsiderness or the marginal without it then re-becoming a kind of like the center, because observation can have that effect on what's being looked at. And so yeah, I think that there is like a value in the peripheral insides of how people negotiate their desires, their forms of queerness that provide them with a space to survive. Like I think about you know um, Jeffrey Brace, who in his like articulation of his life led the selectmen, which were basically the police, um, kicked him out of town because he was critiquing individuals by name for their racist acts against him and his family. For instance, his daughter was taken from him, put into indentured servitude. She never learned the skills that she was promised to learn through indentured servitude. So Brace like takes this massive risk, right, in presenting his argument against the public, against society, which, leads to the book being outcast, but also leads to us now having this book, right? So there's this like double-edged sword where often the effort at articulating the violence that one faces through queerness or through their positionality leads to such the state power doing horrible things. But then it becomes, so it's like, is it a moment to sort of hide and incubate and figure out like the next step when state power has so much force in curating the lives of the marginal? And I think that it brings us to think about a lot, because I think that it's significant that the world we live in today has this like energy of trying to erase records of, for instance, Black Americans in the military, or just Black Americans in the early based on what's happened on federal websites. Like there's this energy out there that's like seeking to efface lived realities. And so I also like admire, the people in the past like Jeffrey Brace and others who spoke back to power and did things to sort of like make their lives legible that caused friction. Um, Whereas someone like, Timothy Dexter, it's like, wow, the Constitution enabled this person to amass an exorbitant amount of wealth. And what did he do? He just sort of like created his own little fiefdom, and he wanted to like perpetuate that through longevity. So there's this, I think that queerness is always the sort of like double-edged force that has the possibility of creating a future, a possible future, but also like subjects one to potential violence, right? Or exclusion.
We do have so we have a couple more questions. Well, there's a few more coming in. Uh, Now, there's a question I actually find this really interesting about the coda of the book. We have Peter Ferry asking, as somebody who has done some work on the history of hair and masculinity, and points out that you have a reflection on this same topic at the end of your book. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So in the book, in the coda, I conclude by sort of turning to the contemporary moment, thinking about what these sort of forms of masculinity in the past might say about us today. And I do this turn where I talk about Timothy Dexter and his statues. And at the time, I think it was 2021, Donald Trump, as part of his like campaign in that long summer of 2020 and 21, declared that he wanted to make a museum of like a field of statues. There were no actual material plans for it, but he had this aspiration to like have this field of hundreds upon hundreds of statues. And I connect that to Timothy Dexter's like aspiration for cultural longevity. And the thing about hair, it's a bit longer to get into right now, but I think what I would touch on is this impulse to create to use state power to substantiate one's own positionality is sort of what we see in both Dexter and Trump, where they both draw upon these aesthetics of masculinity to produce themselves into something to consolidate power. So I would say that these are like negative forms of queering of norms. Um, and the hair anecdote, it's very it's just this moment where Donald Trump's hair gets messed up on live television. And it becomes this moment of like, oh, look, like even this person, will get messy or something. Like there's this sort of like thing about it that always it just really kind of like irked me, like what it did aesthetically, because it kind of like played around this figure, this masculinity that I actually find to be very toxic and very problematic. And it did this humanizing effort that I think like we live with today. Like I think there's ways in which masculinity allows like messing with it allows for this like danger and violence that I think we're sort of like deeply kind of in the mix of. And I just think we need to like continue to like think critically about masculinity. Like, what is it doing? Why is it here? And it kind of like, um, what are the cultural aesthetics that we're trying to sort of like consolidate through masculinity? So read the coda. I'm sorry about that ramble.
I think we have time for one more question, and this comes from Lauren Stafford, who asks, "Is there anything you wanted to include in the book that you just couldn't for space or for the time that you had to write? But were there other things you were thinking about that didn't make the cut?"
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Lauren. I really wanted to have a chapter where I looked at Deborah Sampson and specifically Herman Mann's narrative of Deborah Sampson. Um, I teach Deborah Sampson all the time. I'm intrigued by there's many terrific essays about this individual. Deborah Sampson uh, dressed as a man during the Revolutionary War, lived as Robert Shurtleff, had a very interesting post-war career when they tried to get a um, veterans benefits. Um, and it just sort of like there's a way in which the narrative that Herman Mann wrote is almost like it was too hard to figure out. Like the narrative that Herman Mann wrote about Deborah Sampson is very, it's like florid and over the top, and there's no kind of like, I had a struggle to sense if there was an insight on Deborah Sampson as an individual. And so in my future work, I really want to think about Deborah Sampson, um, and specifically the text of Female Review. Jody Shorb has some terrific work on them. Greta LaFleur does too. Um, and then there's like, I wanted to actually bring it up into like the 20th century if I could. There's so many bizarre things that happened in the 20th century with around these this sort of like forms of masculinity. Um, I forget the person's name now that I'm thinking. But it's this yeah, this guy who like built this totally weird machine in Maine, and he was a sexologist in the 20th century. So if I could like return to this book, it would be like a sort of long history of these forms of like queer masculinity.
That's great, and thank you, Ben. Thank you for sharing this work. There's a lot going on here, and I think it really does tie in. I think, as Don James pointed out, to some really interesting developments in the field. Um, Unfortunately, it's time to conclude today. But before we go, I do want to mention some upcoming events here at AAS. And I'm just going to focus on April. There's a lot more that you can check out on the website, things that you can register for in advance. But just a few things here. First of all, on Friday, April 11th, there's going to be a symposium at AAS called New Insights on Isaiah Thomas, and that's going to feature seven different scholars speaking about different aspects of Thomas's career, and that'll be followed up on that evening with a keynote lecture by historian Peter Onuf, and that's on Friday, April 11th. The following day is a really big day at AAS. That's April 12th, Saturday, and that's going to be a kind of community open house day. This is called Start the Press, celebrating a newspaper that sparked the revolution. And there's going to be a lot of activities here in person, on site at AAS, including a demonstration of historic printing techniques using a replica of the Thomas Press. And that's just one of many other things. So we do welcome people who are in the area to come visit. It is free, open to the public, and we welcome all people to come. It's a really good opportunity to see the building. There's opportunities for tours, and you can interact with staff and some of the materials here as well. So that's on Saturday, April 12th. The final program for April, also on a similar theme, is going to be a hybrid program featuring John Bidwell, who's going to be talking about his recent book, The Declaration in Script and Print, and that is going to be on April 17th. I think, especially given Ben's topic, it's worth pointing out that our summer seminars are approaching, and deadlines for both of them are happening in April. So please check them out online. We have in early June the FIBEX seminar, which is Sex, Gender, and Print, taught by Greta LaFleur and Jordan Alexander Stein. And that's followed later in the summer at the last week of July with the Chavik seminar, which is on the topic of 19th century American photography in the world, taught by Monica Bravo and Emily Volker. So you can find a lot more info about those. But this is a really great time to put in an application if you're interested in this seminar. Thank you so much, Ben, for sharing this work with us, and we'll conclude today. Have a wonderful afternoon.